Hi, it's Mrs. Long here, and today we're looking at my favorite poem in the grade 12 poetry syllabus, which is Vultures by Chinua Achebe. The reason it's my favorite poem is twofold. I obviously really enjoy Achebe's writings, and those of you who've got your memories in gear, you will recognize his name, excuse me, as the author of our grade 11 novel, Things Fall Apart. So that's one of the reasons I love this poem. Another reason is it's just got such powerful imagery, not always comfortable imagery, but very powerful imagery, and it makes an incredibly, excuse me, that was my dog in the background. It makes an incredibly interesting comment about human nature and the nature of good and evil. Okay, so as I mentioned, Chinua Achebe, the author of Things Fall Apart, which is the most widely read African novel. Interesting that it was written and published in English, and it allowed the eyes of the world to focus for the first time properly on African literature. And he's obviously inspired many African writers that came after him. Right, so our big question, the big question that Achebe poses in this poem is the nature of evil. And so what he does is he describes chiefly, he makes two descriptions, one of a couple, two vultures sitting in a tree, and then another of a commandant at a concentration camp. And the question, or the idea that he poses, is that creatures that can love or are capable of love can also carry out acts of great evil, and vice versa. Creatures that carry out acts of great evil are also capable of love. And how do we reconcile that idea in our understanding of the world? Let's have a look at our poem. In the greyness and drizzle of one despondent dawn, unstirred by harbingers of sunbreak, a vulture, perching high on broken bone of a dead tree, nestled close to his mate, his smooth bashed-in head, a pebble on a stem, rooted in a dump of gross feathers, inclined affectionately to hers. Yesterday they picked the eyes of a swollen corpse in a waterlogged trench, and ate the things in its bowel. Full gorged they chose their roost, keeping the hollowed remnant in easy range of cold telescopic eyes. Strange indeed how love, in other ways so particular, will pick a corner in that charnel house, tidy it, and coil up there, perhaps even fall asleep, her face turned to the wall. Thus, the commandant at Balsan camp going home for the day, with fumes of human roast clinging rebelliously to his hairy nostrils, will stop at the wayside sweet shop and pick up a chocolate for his tender offspring, waiting at home for Daddy's return. Praise bounteous Providence, if you will, that grants even an ogre a tiny glowworm tenderness encapsulated in icy caverns of a cruel heart, or else despair, for in every germ of that kindred love is lodged the perpetuity of evil. Now, this is a pretty dense poem. It's a long poem, and you may want to pause the video at this point and read it over again for yourself, just so you can come to grips with some of the imagery that we're posed with. If you're comfortable with that, let's move on. Right, before we look at a closer analysis of the poem, let's just have a look at how it's structured. You may have noticed that it's free verse. It's got different line lengths. The lines are short. So you read it slowly, there's lots of enjambment, and instead of stanzas, it's divided into three sections which are indented rather than a new stanza starting. There's minimal punctuation, as I mentioned with the enjambment, and it follows a sort of logical structure where the speaker makes an observation, then there's a reflection on that observation. We're given the further example, so the initial observation would be the vultures. The reflection, the further example is the commandant, and then the general reflection at the end, which leaves us with this big question. Right, the first section is the first 13 lines of the first stanza, if you will. And we're giving the initial imagery of these stereotypically disgusting birds. They're not pretty. They eat dead corpses. They really were. They got the short end of the biological and genetic stick. But what I want us to look at is that Achebe intersperses positive and negative diction throughout the poem. And what I've done is I've indicated that with highlighting the words in different colors. So you will see that in order to illustrate almost how these really repulsive birds who seem to do things that are just morally reprehensible are also capable of love, because we've got this pair of birds that are nestled close together at the top of a tree. So let's have a closer look at this first section. In the grayness and drizzle of one despondent dawn. Lovely alliteration to start off with. That harsh D sound creating a sort of bleak mood with that alliteration. And it creates a very dismal scene for us. You've got this grey drizzle. And even the word dawn, which is this kind of intersection between the morning coming and the night before, almost as if the day hasn't yet decided whether it's going to really be day or stay night. It kind of reminds us of that indecision that the speaker poses between the difference between good and evil. So the dawn is unstirred by harbingers. Now, harbingers are messengers, but we usually associate them with bringing bad news or a bad omen. Okay. So undisturbed by this, the vultures perch high on the broken bones of a dead tree. Again, we've got that lovely harsh B sound in the alliteration and a metaphor comparing the tree to a skeleton or a pile of bones. So really heavy with the negative imagery, the imagery of death here. But in this image of these vultures, which are rather gross-looking characters, they're still sitting and nestling close. And the second last line here, you'll see his head is inclined affectionately to hers. And if you think back to the picture on the previous page, let me just take you back there for a second. You've got this idea of this little heart-shaped form by these vultures as they nestle into one another. Very incongruous with this idea of these vultures that have bashed in heads. And the metaphor of comparing their head to a pebble on a stem, which is rooted in a dump of gross feathers. You know, they're not pretty, they're not attractive birds, and yet they each have a mate, and they find love, and they can find affection with one another. Let's move on to the second section, the second part of the first section, which is lines 13 to 21. And we've just had this brief little moment looking at these vultures who are snuggling up together in the tree. But now we've got this really horrific image of the kinds of things that vultures get up to, which we probably already knew, but what Achebe has done is he's taking pains to explain it to us. So we're meant to feel this sense of revulsion, which heightens our idea of how can these rather horrific creatures who are basically created to eat dead things can also be loving creatures when they are with each other. So yesterday they picked the eyes of a swollen corpse, picked, swollen, corpse, trench, bowel, gorged. Okay, these are all really unsettling words, very heavy negative diction here. You'll see the absence of positive diction, while Achebe really hammers home this revolting image of these scavengers. Oops, I went one too far. Right, so they picked the eyes, emphasizing the very unpleasant nature of a vulture. Okay, what they do is they wait for something to die, and then they go and they feast on its entrails. You've got eating the things in its bowel. This corpse is in a waterlogged trench. Now, I don't think the word trench there is incidental, because we're going to be moving on to this image from World War II of a commandant at a Nazi concentration camp. So it's probably a deliberate allusion to the trenches and trench warfare. And of course, those of you who are familiar with the sorts of CSI type programs will know that when corpses are lying in water for a while, they get really swollen and even more disgusting. So we really are arrested by this imagery that highlights the horror of these birds. And when they are full gorged, once they finish eating all the disgusting dead meat they can, they then choose their roost, hollowed remnant, with the hollowed remnant of this animal's body in their in range of their cold telescopic eyes. And notice the sort of not dehumanization, because they're not humans, but the metaphor which compares their eyes to a mechanical object. They're more object than animal. Almost reminds us of the scope of a rifle or a weapon, which links, I think, then to the idea of them being around dead things. Not that they do the killing, but they definitely enjoy the after effects of something that is dead. Okay, so that is the end of the first section, this observation of these vultures, which seems to have now caused our speaker, or caused the poet, to have a moment then of reflection. So he observes these vultures, and this causes him to think. And so that's why when we start the second section here, you've got that little sort of strange, it's a conversation starter. Okay. So the speaker is making an observation, and what we're shown in the second section is the very strange image of a personification of love sitting in a slaughterhouse. Okay, so you'll see there we've got the positive diction mixed in with the negative. Okay, so love here is being personified. And he's saying, having observed the vultures, the reflection is now how love can exist in a place that we don't expect it to be, a place of death and evil. And so the charnel house there is the image that he's chosen, a building, either a slaughterhouse or where dead bodies are stored before they're being disposed of. So we've got this very unpleasant image of a place of death, basically. Now, love, who is usually so particular, it says, being sort of personified as a fussy woman, will even find a small place in a charnel house, a place where we don't expect love to find. Just a little corner, not taking the whole thing, just a corner where love will reside, tidy it up, coil up, so in other words, make it as manageable for herself as she can, and perhaps even be relaxed enough to fall asleep with her face turned to the wall, though, because love, as we see here, cannot bear to look upon the horror, but has chosen to dwell there nonetheless. So before we move on to the second part of the poem, which will be in the second video on this poem, because it's just so dense we couldn't fit it all into one, you'll see how the speaker's observation of these vultures has caused them to sort of ponder on the presence of love, and love being able to exist in a state where one wouldn't expect to find it.